Hi, hello, and welcome to this class 2 in Maya 312. This is the part of the course where we're going to look at our character and creature lighting. It's also the part of the course where we're going to be using our live action HDRs. So that's going to be live action HDRs of the candle flames. So I just want to dive into the scene and take a look at what we've got here. And I want to use this class as an opportunity to talk about some of the technical stuff that we're going to be using in this class and also to get familiar with the scene. And then towards the end of the class, we're going to have a look at some references and talk about what our goals are for the final image. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got here. So in this kind of crazy scene, we've got an astronaut here and a tentacle busting out through the visor, and he's grabbed this candle, and we've got these candles over here on the right-hand side of the scene, and we've got these candles over here on the left-hand side of the scene. So something that I want to go for with this setup is I want to utilize the candles to do most of the lighting. And I want to try and emulate more or less a three-point lighting setup. So if we call this candle our key light, we could call this candle our fill light, and we could call this candle our rim light. We're going to be introducing some other lights into the scene as well. There's going to be a HDR sky dome, but the HDR sky dome is not going to really do very much lighting. It's only going to contribute to some of the environmental reflections and stuff like that. So we've also got this transparent visor as well, and we need to refract something through this. Just refracting a black environment back there isn't going to look particularly good. So I want to include a sky dome, but it's more just for environmental reflections and stuff like that rather than any real lighting. We do have some other lights in here. On top of the astronaut's helmet, we've got some little LED spotlights, and I can foresee those looking pretty cool with maybe an AI volume and making some kind of a god ray, something like that. I don't know, some kind of a beam coming from the helmet might make this look quite moody. I think it's also going to help with the colors in the scene because the candles are going to be predominantly an orange light, and the lights on his helmet can be more of a white or blue light. The environment that we're going to use is going to be quite orange as well, quite warm. The materials on his costume or his armor are blue as well. Let's take a look at those quickly. I'm just going to select the armor and come over and find the shader. So the armor shader. Again, we're using the AI standard surface shaders for this. So I'm going to drop down underneath the color. And in here, we've got the color space set to utility raw. Now, this is a good point for us just to check some of our parameters. If you remember back from the first class, we're always running at 25 FPS, but we're also using the ACES color workflow using the OCIO config. If you're not familiar with this, you'll need to jump back to class 1, where we go through how to get this and set all of this up. So if you haven't done that already, it would be a good idea to go back and get this all set up. So anyway, back to the armor. Underneath the color, I'm going to hit low quality and generate preview. Okay, so you can see some of the texture detail on the armor. And it's kind of a nice blue color. So that's going to help offset a lot of our orange light as well. So let's talk about some of the materials that we've got in here and what we're expecting to see when we finally render this. We've got a few different objects, and some of them have got different materials. For example, the tentacle here has got its own shader, which is the beast shader, which has got something plugged into the color and the specular and the roughness. And it's also quite heavy on the subsurface. I wanted it to feel quite jelly-like and alien. So yeah, we've gone quite heavy on the subsurface there. You'll see that when we start rendering it, it lights up quite a lot. Let's have a look at the candle shaders. Again, quite heavy on the subsurface. We've got a map plugged into there for that. It's got color and it's got roughness and all that sort of stuff. The reason why we needed to generate a preview for the armor is it's the only shader and set of textures in this scene that has UDIM tiles. Everything else is on a single tile. So that's why the textures were already visible. So in the example of the candle, we've only got a single tile. The visor has a unique shader as well, and we set that on a unique shader because it's the only thing in the scene that's refractive, and it also has some thin film over the top. which is a great feature that I like in Arnold now. The thin film can get you some really nice glass effects. And the candle holders, these are the only real metallic thing in the scene. The armor's got some metallic components as well, but these are more of like a dirty iron color. So there's a few different materials in here for us to play with and get the lights to respond nicely to. So let's just talk about how the scene's made up. So we've got our astronaut, and at this point I'd like to just give a bit of a shout out to Kieran Ashley Russell, who donated this astronaut to the project. It's really nice. It's really nicely modeled and textured. And we've gone through and just stuck a huge tentacle going through the visor. So we've got our astronaut here in the outliner. And something that you'll notice about this scene, and something that's a bit of a running theme in this course, is that all of the assets are live in the scene. We're not really using references, and we're not really using anything like stand-ins or AS files. We're just keeping everything live. I'm just going to turn the textures off for now. Okay, so we've also, inside our outliner, we've got our beast. That's a separate piece of geometry. Well, our candles and our candle holders are all inside one group, but they are individual pieces of geometry. And we've got this extra parts section. Now, the extra parts section is for some high resolution geometry pieces. We may want to turn on and off as we go through, just to speed up our kind of render times and stuff like that while we're testing things out. So I've kept those separate. We've of course got the visor, and there's all these little pieces of glass in here as well. It's quite a nice effect, and they've got some nice texturing work on them as well. Again, this has got its own shader. Just quickly, while we're talking about the shaders, the candles have got an emission component to their shader as well. There's an emission plugged in right down here under the emission attribute in the weight. Now, we don't really want to illuminate the scene using emissions. It's going to generate quite a lot of noise. It's not really a great way of lighting a scene, but the emission in here is just for the candle wick. I wanted that to have more or less the right kind of fiery look, so I've left a bit of emission on there. We do have a directional light in that scene, and that was just for testing the setup, so we can go ahead and delete that. The first thing that I think we should do is determine what kind of camera move that we want on this. I think it'd be nice to have a dynamic camera move, probably something that travels from screen left to screen right, or screen right to screen left, something in there, kind of like a horizontal move. That'll give it a nice dynamic feel to the shot. So let's just set our timeline at 1001, and by default mine's set to 1050. Your scene might be set differently, but I'm going to leave it on 1050, and then we'll have a 50 frame shot. And let's go to create, and let's create a new camera. So here's a camera. Let's load that in. I'm going to call that render cam. All right, I'm going to drag that into the scene, zoom out a bit. I also think it'd be nice to have a slightly wider focal length. I mean, the scene's kind of absurd anyway, so we might as well make the camera look a little bit goofy. So I'm going to put 24 into the focal length for this. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's just go and set a resolution in the render settings as well, so we can make sure that we're seeing the full frame. So HD 1080 is what we're going to use for pretty much most of this course. So I'm going to close out the render settings. We could turn on our resolution gate so we can see where we're at. All right, nice. So I think the first thing to do is pick an end frame. So we would also want that to rest for a few frames as well. So let's set that to something like 1045, and let's find a good frame. Maybe something kind of around here would be fun. So I'm just going to make sure our camera's selected. Go to the channel box, and I'm going to grab our translation and rotations and set a key. Go to the first frame, and let's find a start frame. Maybe something that frames these two candles in the background would be quite fun. All right, so let's do that. Let's hit key selected. Okay, so just drag it through the timeline. Okay, so it looks quite dramatic. If I right click on the timeline and go to playback speed, real time, let's play it through. Okay, so I think it'd be good for it to start off fast and then end slow. I also don't think that our camera needs to move that far. So let's rotate this around a little bit. I'm going to push in, keeping this candle here in the background, but I just don't want the camera to move so far, so it has to move so quickly. So let's do key selected on that frame and play it through. That's nice because the foreground candle sweeps in front of us, so that's good. So let's go to Windows and let's go to Animation Editors and Graph Editor. I'm going to frame this up by hitting F on the keyboard. I'm going to grab our first keyframe and switch that to linear. This way it'll start fast and then slow. Okay, so let's play that through. Okay, great. So I think that'll work for our camera move. We can always adjust it later if we want to. So I think the next thing to do is have a look at our environment, what we want our environment to look like. So I'm going to quickly jump over to Nuke. So here we are in Nuke. And once again, before we do anything else, we just want to make sure that our color and our color workflow are set up okay. So I'm just going to go down to the node graph and hit S on the keyboard, come over to the color tab. And remember that we're working with OCIO and we're using the ACES 1.0.3. So if you want more information about this, it's best to jump back to the first class if you haven't already done it. And we're always working inside our view transform with Rec 709 for this course. All right, let's close out those properties. Make a read node by hitting R on the keyboard, and I'm going to find this room V002 HDR 1001 EXR and hit open. All right, so I'm going to hit 1 on the keyboard to view that. So this is quite interesting. What we've got here, if I just gain up a little bit, is a wooden room, kind of a medieval sort of looking thing. And it's got a little bit of atmospherics in it, and it's got a sky and lots of shadows. Now, this looks a little bit like a HDR lat long, but it's actually a render. It's a render at 2K, and it's an Arnold render like any other of a scene like this, but it's actually rendered on a spherical camera. There's no values in this scene that go above 1, which would lead me to think that this is an LDR. It's actually 16-bit. It's got quite a lot of range, but it doesn't have any values that go above 1. So this is going to contribute to the environmental lighting of our scene. It's also going to contribute to our reflections and our subsurface and stuff like that. But it's not really going to be lighting the scene. It's just there for an environment, something to refract as well. So this is what we're going to map to a sky dome for this scene. It's also going to serve quite nicely as just a background image too. So let's jump back over to Maya. And I want to go to the Arnold menu and lights, and I'm going to create a sky dome light. And in the attributes, let's come and find the color. And I'm going to attach a file node. So let's dive in here. And let's go and find that EXR. That's here, room V002 HDR 1001. And that's actually in the source images directory for this project. So I'm going to come down and hit open. All right. So it's black at the moment. That's because we've got our textures turned off. So I'm going to turn our textures back on. Zoom out a little bit. Okay, great. So we can see that we've got our environment here. It's a little bit hard to see. You can always just gamma up a little bit in the viewport. All right, so there's our environment. And our color space is set to utility raw for that, which is great. I think that it will be important for us to pick out a slightly lighter area of the environment for just behind his helmet. So let's go to the perspective view. So the lightest part of this sky dome that we've got is this atmospheric area over here. So I want to put that probably behind his helmet on this side. So we've got a nice light color to refract. So I'm just going to rotate this round in the y-axis. So bring it round, bring it round, bring it round. Let's go ahead and view that. All right, so we've got a nice bright area behind his visor, and that's going to help with our refractions a little bit. So I'm going to return our exposure to 0 here in the viewport and turn our textures back off. Deselect everything. Let's go up to the render settings and let's just dial in a few settings. So under the Arnold render tab, camera AA, let's put that on 5 for now. And the adaptive sampling, Let's enable that, but let's put that onto 7. Maybe we can bring our camera down to 4. Okay, so let's come down to the ray depth and we can change our diffuse to 2. And underneath the lights, this is going to be quite a dark environment, so we probably don't need this value. If we had 0.01 instead of 0.001, it will probably decrease our render times quite a lot. So let's just change that. So 0.01. And for some basic settings, I think this is okay. Let's switch our renderable camera to render cam as well. And let's go to the Arnold render view. Straight up to render and update full scene. Okay, so let's abort the render there. Let's hit F on the keyboard to frame up. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got here. Now, it's quite dark at the moment, which is absolutely fine. We don't want this HDR to really contribute to the lighting in the scene very much. We're going to leave that to all of our candles. But if I just turn up our exposure a little bit so you can see what's going on here. Okay, great. So this HDR is doing exactly what we want it to do. It's offering up some really nice reflections in the visor. It's also offering up some really nice environmental reflections as well. It's also offering up some refractions, which is something we were really missing. So that's really good. It's also contributing to the subsurface, which is great. This is going to offer a really nice level of realism. And all of these metallic objects, like the candle holders in the background and stuff like that, we want them to have an environment to reflect. Otherwise, it's just going to be black and not particularly interesting. So let's return our exposure back down to 0. And let's have a look at another frame. So if we come to the end of our shot here, frame 1050, what does that look like? So let's go to render and update full scene. All right, we can abort that render there. Let's turn up our exposure again, take a look. Okay, so great. Again, we can see that it's contributing to some of these nice environmental reflections. If we turn our exposure up and down here, we can see that we've got quite a lot of nice environmental stuff going on. And again, the refraction through the visor is going to be very valuable to adding quite a lot of realism into this. We can see that the subsurface is responding really nicely as well. The areas where the tentacle is a bit thicker, less subsurface, and where it's a little bit less dense, we can see the light coming through. Same for the candles as well. You can also start to see that emission on the candle wick over here, like I was mentioning earlier. We don't want this to be a contributing factor to the lighting in the scene. We just want to be able to see it. But having said that, we will probably want it to be the right color. It's just white at the moment, and we would want this to be orange. So let's just go back into our scene. Let's select the candle. Let's find its shader. And let's come down to emission, and underneath color, let's make this a sort of orange, a light orange color, something probably kind of around this area will work for now. All right, back to the render view. Render and update full scene. Okay, so we can stop the render there. All right, so yeah, so that's a nice orange color now, something a little bit closer to what we would expect. So I'm going to close out this render view. I'm going to deselect everything. All right, good. So I want to talk a little bit about the goals for the final image for this scene. And to do that, I want to hop back over to Nuke and I want to take a look at a frame from a really famous film. So this is a still from Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. Now, just before we go any further, we don't want to pretend that in this course we're going to reach anywhere near the greatness of what Stanley Kubrick can achieve or anything like that. But it's just an interesting frame to study, and it's a good one for us to talk about our goals and how it might relate to a CG render. So let's take a look at what we have here. So we've got a whole bunch of candles in here. So we've got some candles down here on the table, and we've got some candles up here in the background. Now, if we go back to our scene and head over to the perspective view, we too have candles dotted around our character. So back over to Nuke. If we call this our main character down here in the foreground, we've got a kind of a key light that's right in front of his face. And then we've got some candles either side to him that are more of a fill light. They're just adding a little bit more fill light to him. And then we've got candles off in the background that are adding almost a rim light as well. So if we go back to our scene, the candle that our beast is holding, we could call this our key light, for lack of a better word. We can call this maybe our fill light, and we can call this maybe our rim light. And we're going to use candles for all of those. So let's go back to that frame. An interesting property of candlelight, as we mentioned right at the top of the course, is that the light is always very orange. So we're going to want something on our scene to try and offset that. Here they've got a few different colours around the scene and some greens here in the foreground, but we're going to use the blue of our astronaut's armour to try and offset the orange colour. We've also got the added luxury of having some of those little LEDs on his helmet. So if we jump back to the scene, we've got these LEDs up here, which are going to provide a nice white or slightly blue light to the scene as well to help offset the colour of those candles. And something that candlelight's particularly good at as well, in my opinion, is picking out the qualities of different materials. So down here on the table, we've got these coins or chips, and the candlelight's picking out that they're a different material to the table. The candles are also picking out the metal of the candle holders as a different material to the cloth. The subsurface in the wax is particularly prominent. The glass up here in the chandelier is picking out some really nice highlights and pings. If we go back to our scene, we too have some little glass pieces as well. So hopefully our candlelight's going to do a really great job of picking out these little pieces. Let's go back to our frame quickly for a final look. And then just like in our scene, the environment isn't contributing any light. It's just contributing some environmental reflections and some ambient stuff, but it's not actually contributing any light. It's only the candles here that are contributing light. Just like in our scene, the sky dome isn't really contributing any light. Yes, it's putting some light into the scene, but it's not our hero light. It's not the thing doing the lighting in our scene, or it won't be anyway. It's just here to provide some sort of an atmosphere to the scene. All right, let's go back to our render cam. So this is the goal. We're going to take our scene and what we've created here, and we're going to use candlelight to make it look really moody and really effective. I hope you enjoyed this portion of the course. Please join us for the next class. We're going to take a look at building up these candle lights and adding them to the scene.